We are now slowly stockpiling a little library of knowledge in regards to how best to expose certain film stocks in the overexposure versus underexposure series. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a black and white film stock which I'd like to get into shooting some more of, and that's Ilford FP4. Ilford HP5 is a film stock that I've previously shot in this series and is probably my go-to black and white film stock. It's certainly the one that I've shot the most of, but I have found myself over this winter period really wanting to shoot more black and white film. I'm personally not a massive fan of the way colour film looks in the cold and wintry conditions in England, and I find it much easier to get images that I like with black and white film stocks. And because of that, I wanted to see what a new black and white film stock would look like in regards to over and underexposing. Same as with the rest of the tests in this series, I shot the same image of my conservatory, aiming to get some strong contrast between harsh shadows outside and the bright highlights of the sun streaking through the windows. I used the same camera and lens setup, my Pentax 6.7 and the 75mm lens, so that any effect that setup has on the film is consistent with all of the other videos. Compared to Ilford HP5, which is an ISO 400 film, FP4 is rated for an ISO of 125 and thus should result in less grain, and the film is marketed as a high resolution and wide exposure latitude film, apparently perfect for varied lighting scenarios. I of course metered using a spot meter and an app on my phone whilst rating the film at the box speed of ISO 125, and that is the process of how I would typically try and expose when creating images with this camera and film stock all of the time. I should also add that despite the fact that I did recently start scanning all of my own film on a home setup, I did send this film off to the same lab that I used for all of the other exposure tests to ensure that all variables were the exact same and that any light post-processing work that they do to their scans are consistent as with the previous videos. So let's take a look at the completely unedited exposures one by one and then compare these to the base level correct exposure, which is also unedited. The results were pretty standard and what we would expect from a black and white film stock, but I must say that I think this is one of the most forgiving film stocks that I've tested in this series so far. To give you the hard and fast answer, in regard to overexposure, it seems like you could push it all the way up to 4 stops overexposed and still end up with a very usable image, and in regard to underexposure, I could still get a usable image with some pretty clear detail all the way down at 3 stops underexposed. At all stops of overexposure, we do just get marginally more detail in the shadow areas. Of course, there is no weird color shifts and there's not actually a massive difference in contrast levels, at least until we get up to 4 stops of overexposure, which is where the contrast in the scene does become quite a bit more noticeable. At this point, these shadow areas are creeping up towards middle grey, but as we found with most film stocks, the ability to hold fine detail in the brightest highlights and to not clip any detail is really quite impressive. There's almost nothing in the scene that registers as pure white, despite the fact that in real life the shining floor was quite blindingly bright at this point. And as I said before, underexposure actually really quite impressed me with this film stock. It's obviously not super apparent in these unedited images, but the negatives hold a lot of information in those dense shadow areas that with a lot of other film stocks would have been completely unable to be recovered. The unedited one-stop underexposed image actually looks really quite nice as it is. It's just a slightly washed out and faded look, but still pretty contrasty, at least enough for me. At 2 and 3 stops underexposed, we then obviously start to lose a lot more contrast, but I don't feel they have an inherently bad look, and I imagine that a lot of people would be okay with this kind of result if they got these scans back from their lab. 4 stops underexposed is now pushing the negative just a little bit to its breaking point, and it is here that the negative does begin to get a little bit too thin to really recover any detail, and the shadows are just a little bit too muddy and washed out. Same as with the rest of the videos in this series, I did take an unscientific, purely by eye attempt at editing all of the exposures to become more similar to the base exposure in regard to contrast levels and overall exposure. Hopefully you can see just how far you can manipulate the scans from these negatives to get back to what I would deem an acceptable and correct base exposure. And as always, I would just mention that these are high quality TIFF files. They are the highest quality that you can get from my lab that I used, and thus they should be the most editable files that you can get. If you're often up for lower resolution JPEGs, then you will certainly not be able to get this much latitude from your scans. Just something to note. In terms of edited images, you could go with any of these stops of overexposure, at least that's my personal belief. Again, the contrast levels differ a little bit as you get to 4 stops overexposed, and you're going to be working a little bit harder to get a similar looking image, but for 1, 2, and 3 stops overexposed, it was simply a case of adjusting the exposure slider in Lightroom and the images looked almost identical. A huge thumbs up for the ability of FP4 to handle being overexposed. And in these edited images is where the underexposure capabilities also kind of really shine. All of 1, 2, and even 3 stops underexposed, I would say in this situation actually gave me images that I would be pretty happy with and that I would be able to work with. Of course, the more drastically that you underexpose your negative, the less detail you're going to have in the shadow areas. The more pronounced grain that you're going to get in the darker areas when you try to recover that detail, and you are going to lose some contrast and sharpness down in those areas as well. But I would genuinely be okay with the level of shadow detail in 1 and 2 stops underexposed, and would even call 3 stops okay if you're getting the highest resolution scans that you can, and you're willing to spend just a little bit of time whilst editing to get a great looking image. 4 stops to me is definitely too far, but that's still more impressive than a lot of other film stocks. It's just an incredibly grungy and contrasty look to the image. In conclusion, my recommendation, as ever, similarly with the other videos in this series, is to shoot FP4 anywhere in the box speed to 2 stops overexposed range. I just think that it gives the best combination of shadow detail whilst keeping a nice contrasty look. With that being said though, I do think this is quite a foolproof film, that based on these findings, you could over or underexpose by up to 3 stops either way and still get some workable and usable results. If you shot FP4 and have similar findings or completely different results to me, then please do put your comments down below so that anybody who is looking to shoot this film stock can take on a range of results and come to their own conclusions as to how best to shoot the film. That is going to be all for this one though. If you want to see any more from this series, I will of course put a link in the description down below and also leave a little card up the top of the screen up there. If you liked the video, please do feel free to leave me a like, let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below, and maybe please do consider subscribing if you want to see any more of my content going forwards. Stay safe everyone, stay happy, and I'll see you in the next one.